Hello people! With almost 30 years of history at the time of making this video, the Pokémon franchise has done a lot of interesting things since its inception in the mid to late 90s. Although not strictly established in official statements, Pokémon games and other media are pretty neatly divided into generations. There are of course certain criteria that each generation fulfills, like introducing a new region, new Pokémon, a new anime, and a new family of TCG expansions. But this doesn't mean each generation is the same. In fact, I'd even say that every one of them is unique in its own way and has something distinct to offer. In this video, I'll be discussing just that. What is the best aspect of every generation so far? While I do plan on acknowledging the general community consensus on this matter, I will still be giving my own personal opinion, meaning you are entitled to disagree with anything I say. Furthermore, although I will mostly focus on the games, I might mention other Pokémon media if I feel it played a significant role in my enjoyment of a generation or made a substantial impact on the franchise. With that being said, let's get right into it with Generation 1. Generation 1 is most often praised for simply introducing everything that came to define Pokémon. Almost every Pokémon game trope was first seen in Gen 1. The Pokédex, regions, professors, starters, everything. But aside from being respected for being the first, the Gen 1 games themselves are somewhat overlooked in favor of their remakes. This is understandable, as the original Kanto games lack many quality of life features, are visually limited, and are riddled with bugs. I know for a fact that some pretty devoted Pokémon fans haven't even played through the first iteration of Kanto. The most popular thing in Gen 1 introduced is probably the original 151 Pokémon. They're the roster most often featured in merch, and they are usually the most recognizable Pokémon by more casual fans. What I personally appreciate the most with Gen 1 is probably the atmosphere. The Pokémon world is a pretty idealized and utopian setting a lot of the time, but back in Gen 1, before the wider world was established, Pokémon felt just a bit grittier. The villains weren't a sci-fi faction with goals rooted in the fantasy of the Pokémon world. They were just simple crooks. Team Rocket is basically just a mafia gang made of regular criminals whose goals mostly revolved around making money and expanding their influence. The adventure itself doesn't have anything to do with the godly legendary Pokémon, which make things feel a bit more grounded. Kanto also has some locations with a drab atmosphere, like an abandoned power plant, abandoned Cinnabar Mansion, and the famous Lavender Town. You can see how this makes the original Gen 1 games feel more real, for the lack of a better word. I wouldn't want every Pokémon generation to feel like this, but it makes Gen 1 unique. The gritty atmosphere is emphasized by the simple monochromatic graphics, and at least a little bit of that was lost in the Kanto remakes that came out in future generations. I would also like to mention the early anime. It has a certain old school feel that later seasons don't have. The characters have slightly more edge, and the fact that the anime had to make up a whole new arc because they needed to bide time until Gen 2 was released led to one of my favorite sections of the Pokemon anime in the Orange Islands. Hashtag justice for Tracy. Moving on to Generation 2 with Gold, Silver, and Crystal, perhaps the best aspect of this generation is its continuity and connectivity with Gen 1. I'm not just talking about being able to go to Kanto in the post-game, which in and of itself is amazing, if not a little overrated. I'm talking about the fact that the story is a direct sequel to Gen 1 set in a different region. It continues the Team Rocket plot, adds more lore onto the world, and shows off older characters, and of course, you can fight Red, the main character of the previous game, as a super boss. I know it's overplayed, but how cool is that? You fight yourself from the last game. Nowadays, Pokemon games are mostly self-contained and only really reference each other through small Easter eggs, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think having the games be more connected would reward me and other fans for sticking with the franchise for longer time periods, and discussing the lore would also be more fun. But Gen 2 doesn't have that problem because it's intrinsically linked to Gen 1. Johto's dependency on Kanto doesn't always work for everyone. You can see that in the Pokemon distribution and level curve, but it's something no other generation did afterwards, with maybe one or two exceptions that I'll mention later. I understand why they don't want to link stories like this anymore. The powers that be don't want young children to have to go back and play games older than they are to understand the story of the newest title, but I would still appreciate if they started drawing more connections between games, even if they're not integral to the story. Personally, I have a soft spot for the Gen 2 Pokemon roster. They are not the best in battle, and I think Pokemon hadn't yet perfected their design process in Gen 2, but I simply can't help but love a good majority of the Johto originals. Keyword here is charming. Gen 2 also deserves major props for introducing shiny Pokemon and the option to play as a female presenting character in Crystal. Generation 3. Not unlike Gen 1, Gen 3 introduced a lot of concepts that would go on to define the Pokemon franchise. The structure of an evil team with a plan centered around the cover legendary was first seen in Ruby and Sapphire, and it went on to be used in the following 3 generations and remixed in the generations after that. Point is, the typical Pokemon game story formula was first perfected in Gen 3. Interestingly enough, Gen 3 also contains the only main series Pokemon game to run at 60 FPS, at least until the Switch 2 edition of Pokemon Legends ZA. The Gen 3 graphics are also probably the most beloved look for Pokemon among fans, and of course most Pokemon ROM hacks use Gen 3 games as their basis. The Hoenn region itself deserves praise for being one of the most diverse for a long time, with a volcano, desert, different kinds of forests, an area filled with meteor craters, and of course its many water routes. Really, the only major biome Hoenn is missing is a proper snow area. What I believe Gen 3 deserves the most praise for is actually the fact that it introduced a new kind of Pokemon game in the remake. Fire Red and Leaf Green were the first remakes in Pokemon, and we have them to thank for all subsequent derivative games that revisit and or expand on older regions. These games are great for not only modernizing previous entries and often expanding on older regions, concepts and lore, but also for making older regions more accessible for newer players on newer hardware. Gen 3 also featured the Ori spin-offs, Pokemon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness. Those games can be frustrating to play at times, but goddamn are they creative with an unmatched look and atmosphere. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Gen 3 gifted me with my favorite Pokemon Swampert. Generation 4 is a harder one to talk about objectively because it was the first generation of Pokemon I was personally exposed to, and while it is not my favorite, it does carry a lot of nostalgia. Gen 4 was made with the concept of being the ultimate games in mind. Diamond and Pearl refined a lot of features from the previous 3 generations. They added the much needed physical and special split, and they were also the first games to feature any form of 3D graphics. Lore-wise, Gen 4 really made the Pokemon world feel properly rich with its focus on mythology. I think the best thing to come out of Gen 4 is perfecting Pokemon designs. There were good designs in Gens 1 to 3, and there are lackluster designs in Gen 4 onwards, but I believe it was around Gen 4 when Pokemon creature design reached maturity. Starting in this generation, there was more emphasis on well thought out concepts and designs for Pokemon, and the Mons started to feel more purposeful and complex, while the first 2 or 3 gens featured more ambiguous and random Pokemon. I am one of the people who thinks Pokemon designs got better over the years, and I can pinpoint Gen 4 as the main turning point where the signature Pokemon design philosophy began to evolve and come into its own. I also think that the Diamond and Pearl anime was the best the anime had ever been at that time. It's probably not my favorite series now, but I regard it to be better than the original series in Advanced. I understand that at the time it was hard to watch because of hiatuses and excessive filler, but if you watch it now, with the option to binge episodes and skip filler, the problem doesn't really exist anymore. Also, Gen 4 still has the best fully evolved starter trio, and I will die on that hill. My favorite spin-off series, Pokemon Ranger, is heavily tied to Gen 4. Technically, the first game came out at the tail end of Gen 3, but it was made to tie into Diamond and Pearl, so the Ranger series as a whole is more closely linked to Gen 4. I seriously love these games, especially Guardian Signs. Generation 5. Gen 5's greatest achievement is perhaps its level of polish and attention to detail. Graphically, Gen 5 perfected the sprite-based Pokemon look, and the games blend 2D with 3D marvelously, making for a unique and memorable visual style. The animated sprites, while not liked by everyone, breathe new life into Pokemon, and none of the other mainline games feature this approach to animating Pokemon. The Unova games are some of the most impressive musically as well. I'm not just talking about how good the music is subjectively, but rather how ambitious the soundtrack is. You can add or remove different instruments from the route music, which already sounds different based on the season. The music even changes based on whether you're walking or standing in place in some locations. And of course, they made extra battle themes just for when your Pokemon is low on HP or you're fighting a gym leader's last mon. The story itself was also quite unique at the time and more ambitious than the Pokemon games that came before. Remember how I said Gen 2 was the only time the stories from 2 different regions and generations were connected? Well, Gen 5 comes pretty close to achieving a similar effect with Black 2 and White 2. Instead of following up Black and White with a third version, Game Freak decided to make full-on sequels that take place 2 years after the events of the initial Unova games. And yeah, in this case the story is contained in the same region and generation, so it's not quite the same kind of continuity as with Gens 1 and 2, but it's incredibly awesome regardless. Seeing how Unova was affected by the passage of time and discovering new locations feels a bit like going back to Kanto and the postgame of the Johto games and seeing how that region changed. Same concept, but a more streamlined approach. The fact that Black 2 and White 2 are sequels and not a third version also helps justify buying a second Unova game if you already own Black or White, since you're getting a whole new experience rather than just rehashing the original pair of games. Generation 6 brings us into the modern era. From here on out, everything would be different. The jump to 3D model-based graphics was obviously a big thing in Gen 6, but I feel like its implementation would go on to be pretty hit or miss for some people. In terms of community impact, I'm more inclined to praise Gen 6 for the introduction of Mega Evolution. It is clearly the fan-favorite battle gimmick. Even years after Gen 6 ended, fans kept speculating and making designs for potential new Megas. The fact that the feature was still being discussed and missed up to 10 years after the last new Megas in ORAS is a testament to the gimmick's popularity. I also think Gen 6 deserves praise for having one of the most solid Pokemon rosters, due in part to the fact that it introduced the fewest new Pokemon out of any generation, allowing them to focus on better designs. Personally, I really appreciate the beauty of Gen 6. Kalos is by far the most beautiful region visually in my opinion, and some of that emphasis and beauty carried on to how Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire reimagined Hoenn. This is an unpopular opinion, but ORAS is by far my favorite iteration of Hoenn, even above Emerald. Part of that is due to the stylistic charm that the Gen 6 visual style brought to the region. I can't talk about Gen 6 without mentioning the X and Y anime. While not my personal favorite, it is the most popular and critically acclaimed series of the Pokemon anime, and for good reason. They really stepped up the animation and the tone shifted to becoming slightly more serious and action-packed. If Generation 4 was my first exposure to Pokemon, then Generation 7 was when I properly got into it. I swear I'm not 14 guys, I was just late to Pokemon. Full disclosure, Gen 7 has my favorite Pokemon game and region, so I definitely have a bias for this generation. The best part of Gen 7 is, in my opinion, the region of Alola itself. It is so unique, so full of life and atmosphere, and its lore rivals Sinnoh's. Now I think it's pretty likely we'll get another island or archipelago region pretty soon. But right now, Alola's geography is significantly different from any other mainland region. Many regions have islands, but usually there's still a predominant mainland. Alola is pretty equally split between 4 similarly sized islands with unique atmosphere and ecosystems. It's basically like getting 4 regions for the price of 1. Because of this, the areas are a bit less open, which leads to pretty neat route and area design. It feels like the places on Alola's islands are interconnected, making traversing the region satisfying. This boxed-in feel also forces the region to pack lots of diverse areas close together, which I find very fun to explore. Alola feels alive culturally as well. The games make a point to show how this region's culture differs from the others. The people of Alola care about preserving traditions, but they are also the ones who push for modernizing the region and integrating it into the global standard. This can be seen in Kukui's attempt to blend in the local island challenge with the more standardized league format of other regions. In Alola, both people and Pokemon are united. This is even reflected in the SOS Encounter feature, where wild Pokemon can call for allies to aid them in battle. The whole Ultra Beast plot in Alola is just icing on the cake. It's Pokemon sci-fi with aliens, but it also ties into the history and lore of Alola, which helps it not feel too out of place. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are my favorite Pokemon games. While the story in Sun and Moon may be slightly better, I prefer the added features of the Ultra games, like Mantine Surfing, Ultra Warp Rides, and the Rainbow Rocket episode, along with an expanded Pokédex. Gen 7 was the generation that introduced regional forms. This would go on to be a staple in new Pokemon games, and it's one of the things I most look forward to when we get news about upcoming games. Lastly, I feel like I should bring up Pokemon Go. The game technically released before Sun and Moon, making it a Gen 6 game I guess, but it came out in the same year as Gen 7, and Gen 7 contains a pair of mainline games created explicitly to tie into Pokemon Go. You can see how Go is much more of a Gen 7 onwards thing than a Gen 6 thing. Regardless of how you feel about the game in its current state and Niantic's handling of it, you can't overlook Pokemon Go's impact. It basically set off a whole new wave of Pokémania in 2016. It also went on to influence the main series in a number of ways. It is now expected that you'll be able to transfer Pokemon you catch in Go to mainline games because of the app's compatibility with Pokemon Home. But when Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee first introduced this feature, it blew my mind. The concept that I can go out in my neighborhood and catch a Pokemon that I can later use on my mainline game playthrough was objectively cool. It's a revolutionary level of immersion. Can you imagine explaining this to someone in the 90s at the time of Gen 1? Generation 8. Gen 8 is probably the most controversial one. Pokemon struggled a bit after making the jump to HD home consoles. The scale of the games increased, and Game Freak struggled to keep up with it after over 20 years of only developing handheld games. In spite of its lack of polish, the one thing you cannot say about Gen 8 is that it wasn't experimental. I think the best thing about this generation is all the new ideas it played with and the conventions it broke. Not having every Pokemon in every game, fully integrating overworld Pokemon in the wild, introducing DLC in the place of third versions, having mainline games not developed by Game Freak, featuring different art styles across games in the same generation, and most significantly, introducing the Legend series. Not all of these experiments were successful, but personally, I commend the Pokémon company for trying to do something different for once. The Legend series is my favorite thing to come out of Gen 8. It reinvented the Pokémon formula and keeps things from getting stale. It also does the same thing I praised Gens 2 and 5 for doing, and that is elaborating on and continuing stories that were first started in earlier gens. Legends Arceus is a prequel to the original Sinnoh games, and Legends ZA is going to be a sequel to X and Y. Like I said, this rewards the fans that stuck with the franchise and played the older games. Gen 8 also did a little bit better when it came to spin-offs, which slowly started to disappear after Gen 4. It brought back fan favorites like Pokémon Mystery Dungeon and Pokémon Snap, while also introducing a couple new mobile games with varying degrees of success. The TCG had a big resurgence during this gen. This had mixed effects on the hobby, but a lot of people either got back into or discovered the joy of Pokémon cards during this time, including myself. I started watching TCG openings during Gen 7, but I only got into it myself in Gen 8, so I'm partial to the Sword and Shield sets. I especially love the introduction of full art illustration cards. They're common enough that you can amass a good collection without selling your soul, and they capitalize on people's love for the art of the TCG, clearly a category of cards aimed at collectors. We finally reached present day with Generation 9. We're at the tail end of Gen 9, so theoretically, something could still happen to change the public perception of this generation. I mean, Pokemon Legends ZA isn't even out when I'm writing this, so we'll have to see. But I think we've had enough time with Gen 9 to be worth discussing it in this video. As far as Scarlet and Violet are concerned, I think they shine the most when it comes to story and characters. The main story of the games feels genuine and sincere. It's a heartfelt tale of a couple of outcasts finding solace and friendship in each other. The climax feels more serious and tense, and the stakes are easy to grasp because of the player's connection with Arven and the box legendary. As for the DLCs, Kieran is probably the best written character in Pokemon. I really came to feel for the guy, and I found his arc and struggles believable. I genuinely felt bad for being the main character and repeatedly stealing the spotlight from him. The characters overall are more grounded and real than in previous games, even though the setting is still a fantasy world. When I see characters from Scarlet and Violet interact with others from previous games in Pokemon Masters, it feels almost surreal. I love many characters from the first 8 gens, but in a way, they feel like cartoon characters when contrasted against the more realistically written Gen 9 cast. This helps me empathize with them more because I have an easier time imagining myself in their shoes. We all know someone with parent problems, someone who struggles with fitting in, and even someone who's so passionate about something that they were never able to find a friend to match their energy. It's a shame that such a great story and characters are locked behind a game that, while wildly fun and enjoyable, is held back majorly by significant performance issues. I also appreciate that Scarlet and Violet let you wear whatever clothes you want regardless of what player character you pick. I'm a big fan of Pokemon Horizons as well. The series isn't quite over yet, so my overall opinion on it could change, but as of now I love it. Don't get me wrong, I like Ash, but I grew really tired of seeing him in every anime series. He was a perfectly serviceable protagonist for the first 4 gens, but after that, the notion of Ash grew out of proportion and he became more of an idea than a character. His character had such a vast history that it was hard for me to keep getting invested in him because his status as an icon made him too grand. He was more of a mascot than a protagonist. I really appreciate the switch to Liko, Roy, and Dot in Gen 9. Horizons takes itself a bit more seriously as well, and it transitioned the series from a sports focus to exploration. It feels more like an adventure, and I'm a big fan of how almost all of the main and supporting cast is made up of anime original characters. I prefer it to rehashing the characters from the games. To conclude, what I intended to convey with this video is that every generation of Pokemon has something unique to offer. Sometimes people tend to dismiss Pokemon games and claim that every game is the same. I understand why some may feel this way, especially if they mainly focus on the gameplay, but as someone who enjoys all facets of the franchise and likes to immerse themselves in the world and the mood of the games, I wanted to share some of that passion with you all. When I was first conceptualizing this video, I was tempted to call it my favorite parts of every generation of Pokemon, but I thought people wouldn't have much of a reason to listen to some random dude yap about his personal opinions, so I tried to include both my experiences and thoughts and the community consensus. I hope I did a decent job, and thank you for watching.